Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Cavicchia. I'm the Program Director at the Canadian Urban Institute. Welcome to this webinar. I'm in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. We recognize that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. We are mindful of a history of broken treaties and the urgent need to work towards reconciliation. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in the community and on this territory, and I invite you to think about the people who have historically lived in the place where you call home and how we might work towards reconciliation in meaningful ways. First, a little bit of housekeeping. We're recording this session and we will share it with you on the Canadian Urban Institute website. We encourage you to use the chat function. We do ask you, please, if you go over to the chat, to toggle over to all panelists and attendees. That way we can all see and learn from what you're sharing. And while you're there, tell us where you're from, and if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask them. Early in the spring, we launched our Bring Back Main Street project, and we've been working we've been doing work around downtowns and main streets that we're concerned about a myriad of issues across the country that were impacting our main streets, both having to do with COVID and not. A few weeks ago, we launched our action report that has a set of proposals, specific proposals, and we encourage you to adopt some of these proposals and move forward to help our main streets out. Okay, let's get on with this session. So first of all, I'm not supposed to be moderating this session. Actually, my colleague Ariana has had some computer issues, but she's going to jump in after our presentation. So I'm going to quickly introduce Rupen Seoni. He's with Environics Analytics. And we, Canadian Urban Institute, has had a history of working with Rupen and Environics Analytics for at least a decade, I guess. Rupen used to be on our board, so we know him very well. And we adore him. And he's full of information. And Environics Analytics really has a very interesting approach to looking at data and categorizing the people who move around. And so we were excited to bring them on our Bring Back Main Street project, where they took a look at a series of main streets across Canada, and they're gonna so Rupen is gonna tell you about 3 main streets and what it means all over Canada, and how we can sort of position ourselves to respond in practical ways. And then our panelists from those main streets will respond to what they're seeing on the ground. So I'm going to pass it over to Rupen, and after the presentation is over, you're going to see beautiful Ariana in my place. So cheers and have a good session.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's really fun to be here on this project, and a very important project, obviously, given the changing times, the rapidly changing and evolving times that we are in at the moment. I just want to acknowledge one thing. I had a little mishap that has immobilized me just before this webinar. So I am on my phone and dutifully, raising my leg on my couch here. So just in case anything strange happens, please just bear with me here. And I want to acknowledge my colleague Nader Shure, who works very closely with our public sector clients. He is part of my team, and he is here moving the slides forward. So I'll be directing him to do that. So we can start the presentation, and I'll just give you a little bit of background, because Environics Analytics, I mean, the reason we've teamed up with the Canadian Urban Institute and supported with some of our data on the Bring Back Main Streets project has been because we have, first of all, our tradition here. Now you can move forward. Our tradition as a company, just to give you a bit of background, is to produce a whole range of data and analytics on the Canadian marketplace. So population insights, a whole lot of information about population behaviors, media and channel optimization for those who are trying to communicate with the population, as well as all sorts of location intelligence applications. So we work with every industry. Essentially what we do is we produce, our traditional business has been to produce 30,000 data points for every one of Canada's 800,000 six-digit postal codes. So covering everything from current year demographics projected to the current day and forward for 10 years. And we do that by taking census data and then triangulating other sources of data so that we have a more up-to-date view of the population. And then we round all this out by producing thousands of other estimates using a variety of sources that get at the behaviors, the attitudes, the health attributes, the financial habits of Canadians. Now, one of the things that we've been working with quite extensively over the last few years, and particularly since the beginning of COVID, and what makes some of this data particularly relevant to the Bring Back Main Streets project, has been with our suite of MobileScapes data, which is using privacy-compliant, consent-based mobile device movement data to look at the changes in movement in the population. And what this does is it makes data that has been difficult to get historically and is so critical at this time because the world is changing quite rapidly. The propensity of Canadians to move around in their communities is changing based on restrictions and fear and openings and closings and so on. That having very specific responsive data is really critical. And that's what we've been working on over the past little while to take all this mobile data that I think a lot of you have probably heard about. I mean, you may have seen some coverage in how Canadians are moving out and about in their communities early in the days of COVID. There's certainly been many pieces in the New York Times looking at Americans. What we wanted to do was create a source that had enough data for Canada, because that's often a problem, is having good data for Canada in the sample. And then to have the data that is weighted and projected to the population so that we can use it for trending and linking to other data sources so that the context is there. So that's why we're here, is to contribute some of the insights to looking at Main Streets and the changes in Main Streets using this mobile data alongside of some of our other data. So where I'm going to start is giving just a few comments about what we're seeing happening out in Canada generally over this period in the past year. So what you're looking at right now is a chart that's showing what we call our out and about data, which is our weekly estimates for every one of Canada's 50,000 neighborhoods of the propensity of the population to go more than 500 meters from their home postal code. That's what we're defining as out and about. Now, so you can see, as we bump along in the beginning of January, February, that the numbers are high. It's about 80% of the population leaves their home postal code, and then it takes a big drop into into the high 50% range when COVID hits and all the lockdowns start to occur. Through the summer, you can see that we had a bit of a recovery. Labor Day weekend was kind of the week of Labor Day was the pinnacle, where we'd almost reached back to some level of normalcy across the country, and then we start seeing things dropping off again, where people are starting to stay home more, between Labor Day and Thanksgiving. But if you advance, there's a little bit more nuance to this that's quite important to look at. This data we can kind of start localizing and understanding any part of the country, but and also what we've done is we've been able to look at the activities that people are doing as they're leaving home. So we can look at who's commuting, who's going to a commercial place for shopping or entertainment, who is going for leisure or green space, and what time of day they're leaving their home postal codes. And if we look at what the numbers look like from a commercial point of view, I think that's a really important view for the Bring Back Main Street exercise, where, you know, early days before COVID, about 57% of the population was leaving their home postal code in a given week for commercial purposes, going out shopping or whatever, or going to a restaurant. That dropped down to 36%, so quite a big reduction at the depth of COVID. And we only recovered about half of that activity at Labor Day. We were back up to about 45%, and since then we've dropped back down to 41% at Thanksgiving weekend. So we still have a ways to go, and obviously things are moving back, you know, where people are staying in more. And just between Labor Day and Thanksgiving, some of the metrics that we track, the typical average maximum distance from their home postal code and the time away that people are spending from their home postal code has dropped by a quarter. It's already down, obviously, during COVID, it's down generally, but just in those few short weeks, people are clearly spending less time away from their homes, engaging in their communities. We can carry on. So as an example, this is the map. I mean, obviously all this data, we can map it. And so if this is going back to just after Labor Day, looking at, you know, the population on the island of Montreal that has a high propensity to be commuting to school or work. And again, I mean, every place is different. Neighborhoods are different. You know, in downtown Montreal, the residents in downtown Montreal are much less likely, they're in that cool blue color, to be commuting to work or school, whereas parts of the North Island, East Island, and parts of the far reaches of the West Island are much more likely to be commuting to their workplaces. So this, as we know, as we've read, there's a whole sociodemographic profile around who's more likely to be, you know, working out of their homes versus who's working from home. And this is that picture on the ground, and that affects everything that we look at on our main streets and in our neighborhoods. So if we turn this to bring back Main Street, as you may or may not be aware, there are 9 different Main Street areas that the Canadian Urban Institute has done extensive study on to understand what some of the challenges are on main streets through COVID. Our contribution to this has been to look at some of the visits and visitors that are frequenting these main streets both before COVID and now during this crisis, so that we have a better picture of how these changes are happening. So in the context of I'm going to give you a few high-level insights that sort of unify all main streets. And we can break the 9 areas down into sort of 3 groups when we look at the patterns. So now we're looking at monthly visits. And we've got data right up until about 5 days ago. We pulled some data right up to October 23rd, and looking at the trending in what percentage of normal activity, and normal is the same month last year, are we seeing in these different main streets. And these 3 groups of these main street areas kind of emerged. So the central business districts, both downtown Montreal and the King Street area in Winnipeg, are really struggling. I mean, those areas are continuing to struggle. If you look down on the left, those are the percentages of the number of visits compared to a year ago. So back in April, as an example, downtown Montreal, St. Catherine Street was at 12% of the number of visits it had a year ago. Now it's climbed back up, and it's in the 30s. And, you know, King Street in Winnipeg has done a little bit better. It was in the high 20s, and now it's climbed back into the mid 40s. So it's trending back upwards, but it's got a long, slow climb. And so they really struggle, just given the level of activity that we're seeing in these central business districts. Now, if we carry on, there's another group that I've called the non-downtown main streets that have actually fared quite a bit better. You can see the uptrend line in all of these communities. So we're looking at that blue line is Main Street Dartmouth, and clearly the Atlantic bubble is showing. In fact, what's interesting there is that through September and October, Main Street in Dartmouth actually has a higher number of visits this year than it did in September and October last year. So we're curious to see how they managed to pull that one off, given the crisis that we're in the middle of. But Dartmouth has done quite well. Relatively speaking. The other areas in Saskatoon, Lawrence Avenue East in Toronto, and then West 4th Street in Vancouver are all kind of showing a similar pattern. They're back up at around 65 to 75% of their visits compared to before, and they've recovered from 40 to 60% back in the early days of COVID. And then if we move on, there's another group that I've called the small town main streets, and they're sort of small town / tourism. All of these communities, downtown Port Hope, Water Street in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and Water Street again in St. John's, Newfoundland, are, obviously off season. They're reliant on their local communities. So you see, higher percentages of their of last year's activity in these communities in the off season. But all of these communities had a bit of a bump in the early months of the summer that kind of dropped off in late summer, and things are now turning to the off season. So their visits are much lower, obviously, but they're reliant on their local communities to sustain them, and they're not back to normal. So there's still some concerns here about what winter will hold for these communities. Last thing I want to say in terms of general patterns, close in matters more than ever. That what we're seeing across the country is that, in line with the amount of time that people are spending away from their home postal codes and the distances that they're traveling from their home postal codes being much less than before, obviously these local markets are much more, or these, main streets are much more dependent on their more immediate local markets. So understanding who those people are is really critical. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is turn to our three areas representing our three panelists, and just give a very quick overview of what we're seeing on the ground in Winnipeg, which I've mentioned already. If we look at Winnipeg, you can advance, Nader. I just want to tie in some other data to give a bit more context around some of the patterns that we're seeing with that local market. I'm going to turn to some of our other data to help do this. And one thing that you're going to see is our PRISM segmentation system, which you may have seen before. But if not, I'd encourage you to go to our website and put in your home postal code. And what you'll get back is a lifestyle segmentation assignment that we have created. It's a complex assignment of postal codes based on their characteristics. All that data that I talked about, their demographics and spending patterns and behaviors and attitudes, we've basically classified into 67 lifestyle types. Every one of Canada's 800,000 postal codes is assigned to one of these. And what this helps us do is very quickly understand the change in mix of the population of the visits that we're seeing in each of these main street areas when you look at the pre-COVID to post-COVID timeframe. So what we're doing here is we're comparing the visits from last summer to this summer, basically. And in King Street, Winnipeg area, the change in visitor mix is a shift to more lower income singles and newcomers compared to who was being seen driving the visits before. So I've put a few of our PRISM segments up just so you get a sense. I mean, they're fairly evocative by the names. Midtown movers, so a lower income group of singles that tends to be fairly mobile. They move, they'll change home. They're more likely to have changed homes recently. A young group of young people called social networkers, and a newcomer group called Came From Away are all growing shares of visits compared to last year. And the people that are declining come from more of the higher socioeconomic groups, probably the commuters coming into downtown Winnipeg. First-class families, modern suburbia, and savvy seniors are making up a smaller share. So when we actually take some of this information and we can move ahead, there's an implication for the spending mix and the activity mix that you're going to see in the people on these streets, on the ground, that their mix of spending will shift. Now, the estimates that we have for spending don't reflect changes for COVID. We just don't have that data at this point. But the propensity of the population that you see today is going to be categories like sports equipment, computer equipment. They're going to be more interested in personal care and clothing. These are categories that are going to have a higher importance to the current mix. And relative to before, things like childcare, sporting events, and recreational facilities are going to be less important to the group that's on the ground there. Now, if we move ahead and we look at Dartmouth, the main street in Dartmouth is the area that you're seeing on the screen here. We can carry on. Once again, in Dartmouth, what we're seeing on the ground here is there's a larger mix of middle-income families and middle-income seniors from the suburbs and from the surrounding countryside that are making the share of visitors within the main street in Dartmouth. And the declining share of visitors is coming from the more upper middle income families, as well as some of the more lower income younger singles and couples that live in the city. They're making the trek to Dartmouth less often. And the implications here are, greater interest in things like cleaning supplies, pets and pet care, personal care, and less spending on things like restaurant meals and childcare, appliances, and recreational facilities. So, the businesses on Main Street Dartmouth might be considering how they can appeal to this particular population that is going to be, I would expect that the restaurants might be struggling a little bit more in this area if they're not retooling and making themselves more appealing to a different kind of market. And then if we turn to Port Hope, where we also have a panelist, and we look at downtown Port Hope, this is an interesting community also, just given that it has its local market, but is also a destination for tourism from, parts of the Toronto area. What we're seeing here is also a shift to more modest income suburbanites, both older and families. So, segments that we've called suburban sports, suburban recliners, and stressed in suburbia are making the trek into Port Hope's downtown. And we're seeing smaller shares of people from more affluent segments like Boomer Bliss and Kickback Country is more of a country segment that's quite affluent, visiting Port Hope. And again, if we look at some of the implications for Port Hope's expenditures from these visitors, these particular visitors are actually more likely to be spending on restaurant meals, pets and pet care come up, and entertainment, and they're not going to be as interested in things like recreational vehicles, casinos, and jewelry were some of the things that came up. Again, we've got hundreds of data points that we could have looked at, but what I wanted to really leave you with was a few thoughts. Current data, responsive data are important in helping to understand what's going on and how communities are shifting. And we hope that some of this data can inform some of the important decisions in the weeks and months to come as communities recover and we hopefully bring back our main streets. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruben. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just logging in now. Had some computer troubles, but that was a great presentation, Ruben. There's so much great information there, so much to unpack. So I think what we'll do, I don't think we had a chance to introduce our panelists before the call. We have Kevin Narraway, who's a marketing manager at the Municipality of Port Hope, Graziella Grbac, and the executive director of the Village on Main Bid. That's in Dartmouth, which is just outside of downtown Halifax, and then David Pensato, who's the executive director of the Exchange District in Winnipeg. So what I'm going to do is give each of the panelists an opportunity to respond to the presentation. I'll give you each, take 3 to 5 minutes to talk. Just tell us a little bit about the street, what you've observed over the past few months, and try to help us make sense of this data. The number of the decline in visits and how that pattern has changed over time. And then who has been coming to the streets? Who have you noticed that have been coming to the street? How has that changed? And then how have you been responding to these changes? So we'll just we'll start east to west. So we'll start with you, Graziella, and we'll go from there. You're still on mute.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that. I guess what I'm trying to do is I'd rather kind of try to match the data with what I'm seeing instead of telling you just what I'm seeing. So I'm looking at the data and trying to interpret that. And I know there are a few gyms here, and they've really adapted. We had a beautiful summer, and they were doing a lot outside at the beach and in parking lots. So there was a lot of that. They are back up to, I'd say, 85% or so. There are also some necessary agencies like accounting firms, social enterprise, nonprofits with particular clientele that are up the same, and some of them are expanding. Some of our accounting firms are actually expanding. We have a DQ here, so I think there was a rise in comfort food over the pandemic as opposed to healthy food. Everybody wants ice cream. I've never before seen Main Street backed up to get into the DQ. So those are the kinds of things that I think are happening. And I think we're in the center of Dartmouth. So on one side of us is the downtown of Dartmouth, and on the other side is the suburbs of Dartmouth. So those suburban people, maybe before and after pandemic times, they may be going around us or into the downtown more, to the maybe more variety. And now the close to home factor kicks in, where their basic services are obviously here. Also, because we're in the center of Dartmouth, there's about 90,000 residents within a 10-minute drive all around us. And also that demographic is, we did some studies on this before, and there are a lot of older and senior people living in homes and bungalow more around us than any other area in our city. So those are some of the things that I see. I'm saying comfort food, close to home. We have a lot of nonprofit and essential kind of services and sort of agencies and nonprofits that deal with like mental health and disability, those sorts of things. So those kinds of needs don't go down or up, they kind of remain the same, maybe up, mental health, maybe even up. So those are the kinds of services that we offer. We don't have a lot of sit-down restaurants. A lot of them are fast food, so they fared well. There are a couple of sit-down restaurants, and 2 of 3 of them just shut down almost completely over the pandemic and are just gradually reopening. And the other ones, it was very easy to adapt to takeout because they were already fast food. So again, comfort food. So that's all I can say. Thanks.
Sounds like you were well positioned for, you know, as it happens, for what's happened here based on the mix of things that are there.
Yeah. And people feel safe because of the bubble, obviously, the lantern bubble.
Yeah, do you think that, you know, having more people from the local neighborhoods is what contributed to that, you know, that increase in this sort of higher percentage even than last year? Yeah,
interesting. There's some expansions. Yeah, for example, I was looking at another accounting firm to switch things around, and I can't even get in because they've got people on training and they're not ready yet to hand somebody over. So, and there's below our building is it's like a Wayfair store with returns. So it's new but reused. So it's discounted stuff. So we also know that around us, the demographic of income is lower than, there's 2 corridors in our city. We're right on one, Main is one corridor, and our corridor has a lower income bracket. So the stores that we have very few retail, and the bit that we have is discount, high quality, low cost discount, and they are booming. They can't keep up with it. Yeah. So people are treating themselves, but they don't want to spend a lot of money. So they want ice cream and new furniture at low cost.
Don't we all?
We'll go to you, Kevin. So tell us just a little bit, for anyone who doesn't know about Port Hope, but just a quick
So Port Hope is a rural community. It's about an hour from Yonge and St. Clair in Toronto, from door to door. If you make the drive on a nice day. We do rely a lot on tourism because of the small population. We have about 12,000 people that live in their what would be the urban area of Port Hope, the downtown of Port Hope, and about 4,000 or 5,000 people that live in the rural area. It's a massive municipality. It stretches from Lake Ontario up to Peterborough, so it's quite a large piece of land, and a lot of it's agricultural. And it's interesting the effect that COVID had on Port Hope. And you can almost look at it in 3 phases. The early phase from April to June, I think it was just, there was very little traffic in the downtown. We do measure our downtown pedestrian traffic, and the traffic had dropped off considerably. And that was affecting the businesses, and the businesses were affecting the traffic because the businesses were closed for a large part too. They were closed or had very inconsistent hours. So one of the things we did was we in place, a shop local campaign, like a lot of communities have, and really reached out to the local community to remind them not to forget the businesses, to remind them to get takeout food. And then that June to September period, it did pick up again. But what we really lost in terms of tourism in Port Hope was the folks that would have come from the GTA. Port Hope, is because of its geography, has a river runs through the center of it. Large salmon migration takes place in the late summer. We attract a lot of Chinese Canadian visitors to Port Hope, like tens of thousands, even 15,000 visitors. And, and we promote heavily to that market. We run a lot of ads in Mandarin. There's Mandarin signs all around the downtown. There's Mandarin brochures because we know that that audience comes. And because we didn't promote it, and because the municipal council made a decision to close the river down to access, so there'll be no access to COVID, you can really see the numbers. Usually our highest numbers would have been in September and October. They would have been better than even the summer numbers in terms of tourism, but you can see they dropped off. They picked up a little bit there in October, again, just because people still were coming to see the salmon migration, but they weren't able to get actually to the river. They were able to stand on the bridges and watch the migration. So you can see that the data is very accurate, and I think the data that we're seeing there in terms of the people that we're attracting is very accurate. One of the things we noticed during the summer, just by seeing who was in the downtown, there's a lot of people that just seem to come for the day. Likely riding a bike. A lot of people just seem to want to get away from the GTA, from the suburbs of the GTA. And they were just happy to be sitting in our parks because there's lots of space, lots of wide open space, sitting under trees, reading books, things that we wouldn't normally see. People usually, when they come to the downtown, are more engaged. They're in the shops or in the stores or in the restaurants, but they just seem to be happy just being outside and being away from other people. Especially in Toronto, a lot of the parks, a lot of the outdoor spaces were overwhelmed with people when they first started opening up, and I think a lot of people were moving out towards Port Hope to get away from some of those larger crowds as well. So yeah, I think the data is very accurate that you're showing, Rupen. It really reflects what's happening in Port Hope.
Good. Glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to you and talk a little bit more about what that means. But let's go to you, David. Tell us what you've been seeing and what the data what the data says to you.
Sure. It was actually the data was it makes a lot of sense based on the Exchange District as it is. So the Exchange District, our area, about 2/3 of it also comprise a national historic site. So we've got the largest collection of intact turn of the previous century warehouse buildings and terracotta buildings in, I think, the world, certainly North America. So there's 120 heritage buildings in 40 square blocks. So it's a lot. We also, though, are home to the Manitoba Centennial Concert Hall, which is the home of the symphony, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre is here. So you can see there's these big cultural institutions that are located here. So when I see that drop in the kinds of demographics that the data was showing, I think a lot of it is due to that. I mean, we have major festivals here in the summer. We have a lot of art galleries, those kinds of things that are just completely shut down. And for sure, sort of the commuter population. So to the south of us, on our southern borders is the iconic Portage and Main, and that's where all the big office towers are. So while most of the Exchange District itself is sort of 6-story, 7-story buildings, there's also all of those office workers. So it is a unique place in that kind of a way. We certainly saw a drop off from the office workers right away. That they're the ones who sustain our like 40 high-end restaurants in the area. The boutique retail that we have, all of that foot traffic dropped dramatically and was a real challenge. And I would say over the summer, the restaurants did a lot better. We have a lot of patios, and Winnipeggers, I think, were very keen to get out and explore and do those kinds of things. But certainly not to, as the data shows, not to the same degree. We have had office workers come back in the smaller buildings and on a staggered schedule, much like we are here in our office. So people aren't coming back 5 days a week, they're coming back twice a week. And so that's created a lot of chaos for the restaurants because, of course, restaurant business thrives on predictability. You want to know that it starts to get busier around Thursday, so you add more staff, you add more, you buy supplies for that, you prep more. And what we're finding with the restaurants now is they'll just have a massive spike. They'll get slammed on a Tuesday, and then it's nothing for the rest of the week. And then the following week, they'll get 3 days of moderate activity, and it's unpredictable, so it makes it very hard to manage. So that's what we're seeing. We also don't have a very big residential population in the Exchange District proper. It wasn't traditionally a place where people lived. That started to change in the 80s with the Core Area Initiative. And more recently, there's been a lot more conversions to residential. So that population is growing. And the immediate population around us is, basically what that data is showing is that closing in, people coming from closer are making up more of that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, this idea that people are traveling like shorter distances and more people are visiting their local Main Street, something that we've been hearing throughout the Bring Back Main Street project. Like, what does that mean? And what are the implications for you and your role in supporting your local main streets and communities and local businesses?
Well, one project that we did in partnership we identified there's about 7 different business improvement zones that surround the core of Winnipeg, the sort of the central neighborhoods of Winnipeg. So the downtown biz, the West End biz, and a number of the others. We worked together this summer. It was a little late in the season, but I think it has a lot of potential for next year, where we kind of cobbled together the bike infrastructure around our various areas and created a loop that connects all 7. Because when you look at those 7 neighborhoods and when you look at the population base within them, it actually gets pretty significant in size. And until you make that connection and make it obvious to people, they don't realize that I can do that entire loop through 7 neighborhoods in about 45 minutes on a bike at a very casual pace. So drawing attention to the fact that each of our neighborhoods has more people that are accessible and trying to connect those dots, I think that's something that has a lot of potential going forward, because people, just like right across the country, people were discovering bikes again. They were run on bikes, right? First it was toilet paper, then it was bikes, now it's propane heaters. It's but so taking advantage of that, I think is something that we can do going forward. And for us in the Exchange District, it was really a matter of reminding people that we're here. Reminding people, because people do love visiting here from further out than what is sort of the close circle. And every time we did that, every time we successfully reminded people about what they love about this area, we saw people coming back and walking around and being tourists and walking through the parks and things. So it's that is an important factor.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, there's planning implications and marketing implications, communications implications. Kevin, what about you? I mean, something that we've been hearing from a lot of main streets and BIAs is that those places that relied on tourists who didn't have the tourists over the summer, it really gave an opportunity for the local community to enjoy their main streets and enjoy their communities a little bit more. Is that something that you saw?
The downtown is well used. It's the only commercial area in Port Hope. We don't have big box stores and things like that. So it is well trafficked by the residents. But the business, because it's such a small area, small population, those businesses, I'd say, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but 25 to 40% of that the business downtown is from tourism. So it really hurts, when there's not the tourism. And now we're heading into the colder part of the year, the darker part of the year. And if the businesses, if they don't have a good Christmas, and again, that's very reliant on the local population, I wouldn't be surprised to see more businesses close down come the early part of the new year. Now that said, we did have 2 or 3 businesses disappear from Main Street during the depths of the shutdown, but those spots were quickly taken up again by some major major private retailers, and the shops are booming again. So it's quite, the downtown looks quite populated, and even one of the restaurants that's quite successful downtown had a smaller footprint. And because of the restrictions with COVID and the amount of seating they could have, they've actually purchased the building next to them and are expanding into it, so they can actually have more socially distanced seating. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I think this last quarter of the year will be, November, December especially, are going to be really interesting to see how the businesses fare.
Mm-hmm. Did you have anything to add, Graziella, to the conversation about more locals? Oh, you're on mute again.
I'd say we were the reverse of what the others are experiencing, and it worked to our advantage in a different way. So what I mean by that is we're not tourism dependent. So the people that were tourists that would go elsewhere maybe would come here. So that might explain a little bit of an extra bump. And outside of tourists, we're kind of, I think we're, well, in the report, we're called a neighborhood BIA, and that's how I would define it. It is a neighborhood, like your neighborhood store, your neighborhood shop, your neighborhood services. So I think that helped us. We also got to know each other more, and we were more engaged. People became more engaged with our organization, so they came to know us better because we were sending messages about government initiatives, and they became more connected, whereas before it wasn't a priority and we were like an outside organization and they were just too busy in their daily lives. So this way, with the constant contact and information and up-to-date information, we had this coalition here in Nova Scotia that we found out about government incentives before they were even announced. So I was sharing that because as a BIA, my organizations, my businesses are paying me and they're out of work and I'm not. So I was in a real position where I really needed to give them something extra, and we were had the ability to do that. So as a result of that and the pandemic, people became more connected here. The city, and we adapted a lot. So normally we wouldn't have been able to do things like, for example, the city had a program for creating more open public spaces. So in the downtowns where restaurants were against sidewalks, they had more patios. Well, our restaurants are not against sidewalks because we're a little bit, not quite suburban, but outside of the urban core. So we were able to work with our property owners and set up little food court kind of parks in parking lots. And it was great. People just came and got their food from somewhere, and it wasn't right outside a restaurant. They just sat there. And every day we saw people sitting there. We set up plants, we set up a lattice wall. So also about 7 years ago, we changed the land use bylaws, which now allows a lot more residential, like is very typical in downtown. So we're becoming a more urban village, I guess. And so it took a while, but this year, a lot of construction started. So there was demolition and there was construction. So in fact, here in our community, it seemed like things came alive. Like all of the things we're planning and thinking of, it's struggle. It's always a struggle to make it happen. And this summer, it seemed like all our dreams came true. Everything was happening. There were more people in public spaces because we never had public spaces, so we made them. There was more demolition and construction questions and excitement about all these changes that we've been waiting 7 years to have. So we were very kind of opposite of the rest of the community. So very interesting position.
I find that fascinating just to hear that, because I mean, as I've been looking at some of these numbers, I've been trying to figure out like, what the heck did Dartmouth do? I mean, I know there's the Atlantic bubble, but it's just so kind of extreme compared to the others in terms of the activity levels, and so that makes a lot of sense now why we're seeing some of the numbers that we're seeing. I just want to jump back to, if I can, Ariana, something that Kevin was talking about around tourism and the activities with tourists, and there have been some comments in the chat that I thought this might be a good point to kind of address them. One of the questions was, has there been a wholesale shift towards people, as tourists, favoring commercial activities less and just wanting to do recreation? And to be honest with you, I don't know. We have data that could answer that question, but I would almost want to talk to my colleagues who work more in the tourism area to see if they've done anything on that, because I think that's actually quite an interesting point, is trying to decipher what is of interest these days by looking at the destinations that people are going to within the destination, as opposed to just who comes to the main street. what are they doing on the main street? And can we kind of get more insight into that? Because I think that would maybe be a next step to help kind of understand how main streets need to retool. Because I did see a comment as well on the chat thinking, well, what do we do going forward? How, if expenditure patterns are changing, how do we address that? And I don't think we have the answers to that right now, but we probably should be thinking about that. So,
did anyone want to respond to Rupen?
I guess as a bit of a proxy, I suppose we can talk about, we run historic walking tours in the Exchange District in the summer. And they run from May till early September. Generally, we get busier though apart from school groups, late June to early September. In a typical year, we're running those tours Monday to Saturday. They're all by walk-in or by appointment. And we're usually running pretty full days, groups of 6 to 20, 2 to 3 times a day, almost every day, certainly in July and August. This year, we've had maybe a handful in total. So, as a bit of a proxy for what's happened to tourism and even local tourism, I think that's a major factor. And we certainly have seen people using the park a lot more, but not necessarily going into the shops. And yeah, I think the outdoor thing really matters. The restaurants that had patios did a lot better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about data for a minute. Clearly this data is very interesting. It's interesting to see, but I'm also curious, how you would find how you find this data useful and how this could help you in your planning. And maybe not just this data, but what other data are you collecting, and how are you using that to support your decision making and planning in your work? Anyone can jump in first. Graziella, you're nodding, so I'll go to you.
Yeah, so this kind of confirms the way I've been kind of looking around thinking, I don't really see a difference, but I guess I should feel bad for people, but I don't really see, you'd never know we were in a pandemic until you go in shops and see the masks. So the data, thank you, because it explains that. And it just by luck happens to line up, the pandemic and the data and the timing lines up with this 7-year wait for all the roots we've been planting for the sprouting to happen. And that just happened by chance this summer as well. So, and you talk about what future data. So it's interesting you asked that, because right now we're just launching, actually just this week, launching a more of an asset mapping project. We're calling it Dartmouth Connects. Because we're in the center of Dartmouth, there's a downtown Halifax and a downtown Dartmouth, and we're neither. So people shop here from all over, from suburbs and the downtown, and they stop by our customer base, but it's always been a transient place. So we want to get to know who those customers are collectively. So we're just about to launch Dartmouth Connects, which is a very quick, short survey. And we're looking at more like psychographics as opposed to demographics, your income and your age. So what do you like to do? What do you want to do? What did you always want to do? Would you like to mentor someone in doing something? So we think that might tell us something about the themes, maybe as an organization, that maybe we could offer certain themed events. Maybe some of our businesses, maybe a store that sells socks, maybe they should sell pantyhose, that kind of thing. So it could be different lines of products or kinds of services, and maybe more connections with the businesses and the customer bases of other businesses on the same street or next door. So we're just about to launch that. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
What about you, David? Does this data help you make the case for support for our downtowns?
Yeah, definitely. I think helps us to understand where we can be directing our attention and our effort, and where some of the weaknesses are that we can be providing support with. So we can be a little bit more targeted, I would say, in the next couple months. We will obviously, we have things planned already, but the way that we approach it and who we're targeting and who we're talking to, this will be very helpful.
Is there other data that you're collecting?
We're just starting to. We're actually in the middle of a planning process for the area, so we're collecting. that's more long-term related stuff. So.
What about you, Kevin?
We do collect a lot of data on what's happening downtown. As I mentioned, we do have a pedestrian traffic counter that, what I would say to people is that's sort of the blood pressure of what's happening downtown. We keep an eye on it. It gives us an idea. If we run an ad campaign, we can certainly see the, the clicks and the, social media trends and things like that. But what we can't see is, did that actually translate into people on the street? And so that's sort of the last gateway to say, that ad campaign did put people on the street in Port Hope. So that's an important measurement for us. What this data points out to me is, that certainly, COVID has, and it makes sense, in the ways it has impacted the who's coming to Port Hope and what they're interested in. But again, though, some of it is because certain businesses are closed as well, right? That's, it's actually, the businesses are actually affecting who's coming as well, I think, to a large extent. What's going to be curious, would be really helpful, I think, is to be able to look at this again a year from now to see what, to see if some of these trends have continued, or if they've, or if we've gone back to, who was our typical, tourist prior to COVID happening. I think that would be helpful, because I think we're seeing a snapshot. We saw a snapshot of what happened before COVID. We're seeing what's happening during COVID. Now what's it look like whenever we get out the other side, right? What's it going to look like? And did those people, did it make permanent changes to who's coming to our community? That's what would be really interesting. Right. Because that does start to then shape, planning, thinking, events, all those things will have to now start to be reconsidered, because we've lost our traditional audience. And I mentioned this yesterday when we were having a quick chat, Rupen, that one of our big mainstays in Port Hope is the Capitol Theatre. It would attract 50 to 70,000 visitors a year, and that's completely gone. And that demographic tends to be 60 plus, relatively affluent, and those people were not in the community at all this year. So,
I think, and jumping off of what what you're saying, Kevin, again, is there's a comment in the chat from someone from the town of Innisfil around remaking main streets, and how you kind of look at the long-term benefits and countering against risk avoidance and making an expenditure that maybe isn't going to pan out. Frankly, it often boggles my mind, to be honest with you, how much reluctance there is, and maybe it's just not an understanding of what the data and analytics can tell you to help you make better decisions, that so many organizations, whether they be private sector developers or whether they be parts of government, are willing to make, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in investments in things that are in infrastructure that's quite expensive, when knowing the population that you're actually trying to target to, and having some of those analytics, just making a slightly better decision justifies making those investments, and knowing the market, knowing the population, knowing where things are going, so that you can tailor what you're doing and set yourselves up for success. I think it's really important. And I mean, okay, I get that I live in that world, but so I don't take much convincing, but it's surprising. I think there has to be a greater understanding of what analytics and data can provide to helping make better decisions. And I think that's probably what's missing.
Well, I would say, I just want to add though to that, Rupen, is that sometimes with the data, what you can draw from the data, the decisions you make might be counterintuitive. So, the Exchange District saw a massive revitalization in the late 90s and early 2000s by elected officials making decisions that would seem counterintuitive. So Waterfront Drive is a road that was constructed along the Red River, former rail line. The whole area was, basically looked like a bombed out, shell. The city did the most expensive stretch of road it ever did. It was like over $11 million for just about 2 kilometers of road, because so that investment seems ridiculous, right? But to be able to look at that and go, well, this is undervalued, and if we put this kind of infrastructure in, it'll improve the value and make the area better. So sometimes you go, well, there's nothing there, why would we put money into it?
Right. Right.
Where there's no people there, why would we put money into it? Like
Right.
there's
Right.
that.
You're creating a place is what you're doing. Right? Yeah.
Well, as usual, these conversations go really quickly. We just have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll just give everyone a chance for any closing remarks and what you're hoping to see over the next couple months on your Main Street. We'll go the opposite way this time. So, David, start with you.
Winter is coming, and Winnipeg is facing the worst of the pandemic that we've had yet, right? So the first round, we didn't, as some of the people that I know in healthcare have told me, we didn't actually flatten the curve, we just stopped it from beginning, really. So we're really seeing it for the first time now, and people are very anxious. So we are looking, well, we're looking to see what we can do, you know, helping the businesses pivot, helping to attract people into the area, just keeping things going, really.
Kevin?
You know, what I'm hoping for is, you know, that you know, local residents, you know, consider Christmas shopping in downtown Port Hope. You know, and I do think there's an opportunity for Port Hope to attract visitors from the GTA who maybe, you know, who would typically shop in a mall, might think, you know what, I'm gonna go shop in a small town this Christmas. Because it is actually a great article on CBC last November, December about the most beautiful places to Christmas shop, and Port Hope was ranked number 2 in Ontario. So, you know, we invite people to come and shop in Port Hope and do their Christmas shopping there. And, you know, and that may, you know, help some of these little businesses get through the winter, because it's going to be difficult, I think, you know, especially the restaurants. Although, you know, that said, I was in a restaurant last Friday and I was surprised by how many people were actually in the restaurant. The tables were all socially distanced, but the restaurant was full for the most part, which I didn't anticipate. So I think people are, you know, there's very, very few cases of COVID, thankfully, in our neck of the woods here, and hopefully that trend continues, and you know, people can stay healthy, and we can get out and shop and enjoy our little downtown.
Great. Graziella.
So I just want to say, I don't want to present like a roses and rainbow picture. I wanted to acknowledge that because of a lot of the government support and those initiatives that they had going through COVID, we are where we are. Our people really did struggle in the early times. And also that we are still taking it seriously. I mean, obviously the bubble makes it easier for us, but really people are taking seriously. You don't see people wearing masks outside, but when you step inside all public spaces, we do still all wear masks. So just to let you know, we are really still, you know, bracing ourselves. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're prepared and we're aware, and we're grateful for that support. I know it would have been a lot worse if we didn't get that support. So
Thanks for that. The last word to you, Rupen.
Boy, well, I guess, you know, it's an evolution in our understanding about what's going on out there. So I just look forward to doing more around, you know, gaining more of that insight as to how things turn around and come out of this crisis. But I guess I'll just leave the thought with, you know, in the end, a lot of these decisions are very locally and temporally dependent on what's going on in that place. So we have to be local and specific. You know, broad brushstroke things help understand what's going on in the country or the province, but in the end, these are local decisions that need local action and local information to help support that.
For sure. Well, thanks very much for pulling all that data together, and thanks to our panelists and everyone who participated on the chat. That's all for today. And keep an eye out for the recording, which will be up next week. Thanks very much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.